Welcome to First Unitarian Church, where our mission is to explore the eternal, nurture community, and pursue the common good. Whoever you are, whomever you love, wherever you are on your spiritual journey, and whatever your life circumstance, you are welcome here.
Aboriginal elder, artist, and activist Lilla Watson once said, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And indeed, our liberation is bound together. Black liberation, queer liberation, disability liberation, trans liberation, poor liberation, women's liberation, workers' liberation, indigenous liberation, immigrant liberation, earth liberation, all beings liberation, all of us bound together in the struggle for peace, for meaning, for belonging, for justice, for healing, for wholeness. In the words of Reverend Martin Luther King, we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. And so, because our liberation is bound together, let us work together. Let us worship together. Let us wonder together. Let us be together. Marilee, would you light our chalice for us this morning?
Okay, Charlie?
We light this chalice as a symbol of our sacred time together. The burning chalice represents the light of reason and science, the warmth of loving community, the cleansing heat of justice, and the flame of hope.
Thank you, Charlie. Our opening hymn is number 153, "Oh, I Woke Up This Morning." This is an African-American spiritual, and in many Christian churches today, you may hear the words, "Oh, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus." This version, the version that we find in our hymnal, was created by Reverend Osby of Aurora, Illinois, when he, along with about 250 freedom riders, spent 40 days in Hinds County Jail in Mississippi. This version was closely associated with voter registration drives in the 1960s. We'll hear it sung by the Freedom Singers, led by the great Bernice Johnson Reagan. You are very welcome to sing along at home, and you'll see the words on your screen.
I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind, Lord, set on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. I'm walking and talking in the mind set on freedom. I'm walking and talking with my mind, Lord, set on freedom. I'm walking and talking with my mind set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Who walk, walk, the money, who walk, walk, who walk, walk, the money, walk, 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 who walk, walk, who walk, walk, the money, walk, walk, gotta talk, talk, you 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 gotta You gotta talk, talk with our talk, 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 talk. Cause it ain't no harm to keep your mind. Keep it set on freedom. It ain't no harm to keep your mind, Lord. Set on freedom. It ain't no harm to keep your mind. Keep it set on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
This is a story about a salute that shook the world. It starts with two little kids, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Tommy Smith was born on June 6, 1944, in Clarksville, Texas. He was the seventh of 12 children born to farmers Richard and Dora Smith. His family was very poor, and he and his brothers and sisters worked in the fields as many as 12 hours a day. Tommy wanted to race, but his family needed everyone to help with the farming. So Tommy's father told him that if he came in first place, he wouldn't have to work in the fields with his brothers and sisters the next day. So Tommy started winning race after race. He was so fast that people started calling him the Jet. John Carlos had a different kind of childhood. He grew up in Harlem in New York City. John always knew he was good at sports, and originally he wanted to be an Olympic swimmer. But John's father explained to him that the training facilities he needed were in private clubs, that only white and wealthy people were allowed to use. John sometimes stole food from freight trains with his friends, and then he'd run with it into Harlem and hand it out to the poor people. When the police chased him, he ran so fast that he was the only one who never got caught. Both John and Tommy went to San Jose State University, where they ran track and field. And they were such good runners that they were invited to join the U.S. Olympics team during the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. Now, it's important that this happened in 1968 because that was a very important year in U.S. history. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Senator Robert F. Kennedy were shot to death by men who were full of hate. There was a war going on in Vietnam, and there were protests by women, poor people, farm workers, Black people, and other oppressed people who wanted to have equal rights and to be treated with dignity and respect. Tommy, John, and the other Black athletes who were part of the U.S. Olympics team were chosen to represent their country, but at the same time, they were treated as second-class citizens. They weren't allowed to eat in some restaurants just because of the color of their skin, and they were forced to use different toilets and different facilities than the ones white people used. Some people thought that Black athletes should refuse to participate in the Olympics as a protest against racism in the United States. Now, eventually they decided to participate, but many of them wore badges that said Olympic Project for Human Rights as a symbol of their fight for equity and justice. Each Black athlete would decide in their own way how to protest against racism and injustice. They all knew that taking a stand would be very dangerous. The president of the Olympic Committee, Avery Brundage, hadn't made any objections against Nazi salutes during the Berlin Olympics in 1936. But in 1968, he threatened that any Black athlete who protested racism would be punished. They would be sent home and not allowed to compete. Well, many of the Black athletes and their coaches also received threats of violence. They believed that people in the audience might shoot them if they dared to protest. But then it was time for Tommy Smith and John Carlos to run. They ran so fast that Tommy broke a world record and came in first place. John Carlos came in third place. Now they had to decide, what would they do? Would they be safe or would they speak out? 20 minutes before they went to get their medals, they made their plans. They decided to speak out. They wanted to wear black gloves in solidarity with Black rights movements and also as a symbol of unity and strength. They only had one pair of gloves, so they had to split them up. Tommy wore the right-hand one, and John wore the left-hand glove. They wore black socks with no shoes, and they rolled up their pants as a reminder of the poverty in which they grew up and in which so many Black children lived. Around their necks, they wore beads as symbols of the chains and the nooses that had enslaved and killed so many Black people throughout history. They both walked to their places, and when the national anthem began, they bowed their heads in seriousness and in honor. They raised their fists high, and they prayed. They had received so many death threats that they knew they could be killed, but they stood there in protest anyway. And the huge stadium, over 50,000 people, went silent. John Carlos later remembered that it was like being in the eye of a hurricane where everything is quiet and still. There wasn't a sound. And I'll finish my story and tell you what happened next in just a few minutes. But first, Marilee Perriam, our worship associate today, has a reflection that she'd like to share.
Hi, I'm Marilee Perriam. I've been a member of this church for about 8 years, and I am racist. For a long time, I didn't think I was racist. I thought that because I didn't dislike or mistreat anyone of a particular race, I was clearly one of the good guys. I can identify two main ways that I became racist. First, I grew up in a racist society. Being colorblind was in vogue in the 80s and 90s, and it was pretty easy to be colorblind going to a Catholic school in Phoenix, Arizona. I can't name a Black person I knew until I was 12 years old. But I know that many of the images of bad guys on TV were Black, and I was definitely given the impression that the problem of slavery and racism had already been solved. Everyone was on a level playing field now. The message I got was that Black people needed to do better. The second way that I became racist was through my family. My parents grew up in the 40s and 50s in central Detroit. Many stories of their white flight from the city and why they fled is part of our family lore. I remember as a kid learning about slavery, the Holocaust, and other huge horrifying acts of inhumanity. I was amazed that anyone could think those things were okay. I was baffled that good people didn't speak up and stop it. I developed a determination that if anything crazy like that happened anywhere near me, I was going to stand up and stop it, no matter what it took. But I didn't see it, not as a kid, not as a young adult. I didn't realize that the GI Bill was withheld from Black people. I didn't know that Black people couldn't get home loans or buy houses in certain neighborhoods. I didn't know that Black drug abusers were prosecuted differently than white drug abusers. And I didn't know the countless ways that over-policing, police brutality, and mass incarceration were damaging Black lives, families, and communities. I bought the story that Black people as a race needed to clean up their act and do better. They're keeping themselves down. A racist story, a racist attitude. A racist backdrop in my life that makes me conscious of when I'm around Black people. That leaves me feeling a little more vigilant, sometimes uneasy around Black men. I don't want to be the woman who clutches her purse when a Black man comes near me. And definitely not the woman who calls 911, convinced I'm being threatened when I'm not. It feels bad to say it out loud. I'm racist. But I think it's necessary to acknowledge. And that knowledge can help me to make conscious decisions of how to deal with my own racist tendencies. Reverend Diana asked me what opened my eyes to the racism in myself and our country. And I wish I could put my finger on it. I think it's been a gradual journey over years. Perhaps starting when I worked as a counselor for a juvenile drug court and saw clearly that these were good kids in bad circumstances. Perhaps when Anna was first born and we sat for hours nursing. Meanwhile, I read all the details of what was happening in Ferguson in 2014. Perhaps reading books by Sister Helen Prejean and Ta-Nehisi Coates. Certainly working with Voice, learning about how fines and fees are devastating families in Oklahoma. And maybe belonging to a church like this, where the focus is often giving a voice to those without power. Whatever it was that got me here, I now know that there is a huge, horrifying act of inhumanity going on right now. It would be so easy for me to ignore it because it doesn't affect my day-to-day life. I'm safe. But living in Oklahoma, where we incarcerate more Black people per capita than any other state, in a country where we incarcerate more people than anywhere, we are at the epicenter of this phenomenon. If this huge, horrifying act of inhumanity is going on anywhere, it's going on right here. I believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And what does that belief mean if it doesn't affect my behavior? So what do I do? Well, I'm confident there are many things I'm not doing, but I can tell you some of what I've tried to contribute. After the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, I spent hours each day writing long, thoughtful, researched responses to every jerk on the internet. That was absolutely soul-crushing, and I totally don't recommend it. But a lot of things have actually enriched my soul. Reading the work of Black authors, intentionally buying from Black-owned businesses, working with Voice on restorative justice, going to protests and actually standing side by side with the people most affected by this problem, and writing letters to public officials rather than jerks on the internet. And something I need to keep working on, intentionally developing relationships with all people who are different than me, including Black people. On top of trying to stop huge, horrifying acts of inhumanity, I really believe that diversity is a strength. And I believe that our world, our state, our community, and I all benefit when everyone is at the table, when we can all give and take from each other, and everyone is valued. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilee. Every Sunday, we take an offering. Since 2002, all the cash and designated checks from that offering have gone directly to external nonprofit organizations doing good work in our community, our Change for Change partners. This month, our Change for Change partner is Hope for the Future. Hope for the Future is a nonprofit visitation center that offers a warm, safe, home-like setting for children who have been removed from their homes by child welfare. so that they'll be able to visit with family members. Between its opening in 2016 and now, Hope for the Future has served over 490 children, approximately 187 families, and the number continues to grow. So at this point, I'll play some music and give you all some time to make your donation to our special Change for Change. You may wish to make your donation using a credit card through our website, or this could be a good time to find your checkbook, write out a check, and put it aside to mail to First Unitarian first thing tomorrow morning. And since we didn't have a regular worship service last Sunday, I ask that you be especially generous today. Let today's offering reflect our highest aspirations for the work of this church in the world. And we're going to hear hymn 155, Circle Round for Freedom, written by Linda Hirshhorn, performed by Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout, who's the director of music at First UU Congregation in Ann Arbor.
Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for its soul, for the children of our children. Keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom. Circle round for peace. For all of us imprisoned. Circle for release. Circle for the planet. Circle for its soul. For the children of our children. Keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom. Circle round for peace. For all of us imprisoned. Circle for release. Circle for the planet. Circle for its soul. For the children of our children. Keep the circle whole.
Something a little different and special for our meditation this morning. It's a visual meditation. It's a short film produced by a group called The Work of the People. And the text is from a work called Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander by Thomas Merton, an American Trappist monk, a mystic, poet, and a social activist who died in that fateful year, 1968.
In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, at the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being man, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate, as if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me now that I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. Then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the depths of their hearts, where neither sin nor desire nor self-knowledge can reach the core of the reality, the person that each one is in God's eyes. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. There would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. But this cannot be seen, only believed and understood by a peculiar gift.
In the Olympic Stadium in Mexico City, it was completely silent. Eventually, even the voice singing the national anthem went quiet. After what felt like a long time, Tommy Smith and John Carlos heard an announcer in the stands say simply, "Oh my." And then it began. First, there was a wave of boos. Then people began throwing things and screaming racist abuse. People shouted the N-word and said things like, "Go back to Africa." And "Is this how you treat us after we let you run in our games?" Avery Brundage insisted that Smith and Carlos be punished, or else the whole US team would be sent home. Tommy and John were immediately kicked out of the Olympics, and not only that, they were banned for life. Back in the United States, the two found it hard to find a job, and they experienced difficult financial times. Two of John's brothers were pulled from their military units and discharged. Both families received frequent death threats. Tommy believed that his mother died because of the stress of it all. John's children were told at school that their father was a traitor and his wife was harassed in the press. A headline in Time magazine had the words "faster, higher, stronger" crossed out and replaced with "angrier, nastier, uglier." The Los Angeles Times called their salute, quote, Nazi-like. Well, eventually the world would stop punishing them for their protest and would even recognize and award them for their courage. Tommy would go on to become head track and field coach and a college professor of sociology. John became a counselor and he worked for the US Olympic Committee. Both received the Arthur Ashe Courage Award and were entered into multiple sports halls of fame. But by then, they had already suffered greatly for having the courage to stand up and speak the truth. I was just a little kid when all of this was going on. To be honest, I don't remember anything about it at the time, but later, when photos of the famous salute would appear on the news or in magazines, my parents and other adults I knew, all white folks, would shake their heads and say something about how it was wrong to mix politics with sports or to embarrass your own country. I do remember my mother once pointing at that white man in the photo, the silver medal winner, and saying, I just feel so sorry for that poor guy. That was his chance to be honored for what he accomplished, and they took that moment away from him. Even now and then I would see that photo of the salute and I'd wonder about that white guy on the platform. But I never went beyond assuming that my mother's assessment of the situation was correct. That this poor, unknown white man had his moment in the spotlight, his moment of glory stolen from him because of what Smith and Carlos did that day. Only recently, I bothered to read more about it, and I learned the truth that is not at all what I'd assumed. That white man on the platform was Peter Norman. Like Tommy and John, Peter grew up poor, but in the countryside outside of Melbourne, Australia. At the age of 13, he became an apprentice to a butcher, and he mostly ran at Sunday school picnics. But Peter loved to run, and despite his asthma, despite the fact he never trained at high altitudes, Peter was able to join the Australian team at the 1968 Olympics. There, in the thin air of Mexico City, he ran faster than ever before, breaking world records. Going into the Olympic Games, no one would have thought that he had a chance against John Carlos and Tommy the Jet Smith. But in the 200-meter finals, Peter came in second place. So now we need to go back to that time, 20 minutes before the three medalists go to receive their awards. Peter wasn't just white, he was from a different country. You might have thought that his fight had nothing to do with the struggles that Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and so many other Black Americans faced every day. But it did. Because Australia at that time was second only to South Africa in its apartheid laws. It wasn't until 1962 when Native Australian people were finally able to vote. And at the time that Peter was running in Mexico, there was still a campaign going on in which Aboriginal children were abducted from their families and adopted by white couples or put into institutions where they were forced to adopt white culture. Similar to what happened to Indigenous people in our country, the idea was that because Indigenous people were believed to be inferior to white people, Aboriginal people would be assimilated and their culture would die out. Peter Norman recognized that the struggle of Black Americans was bound together with the struggle of Aboriginal Australians, which was bound together with his own personal struggle as someone who had known what it was to be poor and who believed in the inherent worth and dignity of all people. So instead of resenting the protests that Tommy and John were about to undertake, Peter asked what he could do to support them. He didn't argue for one of the gloves. He didn't steal their thunder by raising a fist along with them, but he put on an Olympic Project for Human Rights badge. And he said, "I will stand with you." John Carlos would later recall that he expected to see fear in Norman's eyes. He didn't. In his words, "I saw love." John would also say that he didn't raise a fist, but he did lend a hand. Years later, John and Tommy recalled they were asked, whatever happened to that small white guy who had stood with them on the platform that day? What had happened was more insidious, less overt than what had happened to Tommy and John, but it was also devastating. Simply because he stood in solidarity, Peter was kicked off the Australian Olympics team. He ran and qualified 13 times for the 200-meter race. He was objectively the 5th fastest runner in the world, but he wasn't selected for the 1972 Australian team. Rather than accept him, Australia had no sprinters at all in the Munich Games. As late as 2000, Peter had still not been forgiven by his country, and he was not invited to attend the Olympics in Sydney, even though he still held the Australian record. It's not clear what might have been different if Peter had recanted, if he'd spoken out against Tommy and John, but he never did. He stayed true to his friends. And when he died in 2006, Tommy and John were there as his pallbearers. At the funeral, Tommy said about his friend Peter, quote, "He believed that right can never be wrong." So, why am I bothering to tell you this story about something that happened over 50 years ago? Why does it matter given everything that's going on now? Well, here's why. Because today, since the videotaped murder of George Floyd by racist police in Minneapolis, white people have been coming out in support of Black lives in a way that is unprecedented. So many of my own friends and acquaintances, including people who maybe rolled their eyes and made comments about the inappropriateness of mixing politics and sports when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, they are now putting Black Lives Matter frames on their Facebook profile pictures, calling out police brutality against Black people, even showing up to protest. Suddenly, saying Black Lives Matter has gone from being too political, too edgy, to being cool, even expected among progressives, including Unitarian Universalists. And it's beautiful, and it's exciting. And the last thing I want to do is be a downer when the whole world seems determined to be one big downer. But I have to ask the question, will it last? It's happened before. After the Civil War with the birth of Jim Crow, after the Civil Rights Movement with the birth of the so-called war against drugs, white folks who were allies in the struggle against racism somehow lost steam. We somehow got distracted by other things. We somehow got tired when it became clear that decentering whiteness wasn't going to happen overnight. And we abandoned our Black siblings and found nicer, less obvious ways to be racist. So there are historical reasons why I need to ask this hard question. Will white support of Black Lives Matter last this time? Back in 1964, when Malcolm X was asked how white people could be allies to Black people, he responded, quote, "By visibly hovering near us, they are proving that they are with us." But the hard truth is this, that helping to solve America's racist problem isn't this. Where the really sincere white people have got to do their proving of themselves is not among the Black victims, but out on the battle lines of where America's racism really is. And that's in their home communities. America's racism is among their own fellow whites. That's where sincere whites who really mean to accomplish something have got to work, unquote. Today, many Black activists are suggesting that it is no longer sufficient to be an ally. What the movement needs is accomplices. Willie L. Jackson wrote recently, quote, "Disruption isn't easy or polite. What I'm hoping to impress upon folks is that this work, the work of being an accomplice, might cost you something. Perhaps your comfort or your social standing, maybe even your safety. Real advocacy and comfort rarely go hand in hand," unquote. And so I return to the model of Peter Norman. Peter stood with Tommy and John. He didn't raise a fist, but he lent a hand. He took the struggle home in standing up to his fellow white Australians, and he paid the price for that. He disrupted the status quo. He refused to be polite. He was an accomplice, and it cost him his career and much more. Just 2 years before Peter died, a statue was erected at San Jose State University that showed Tommy and John in their salute, but left Peter completely out of the picture. The silver medalist podium was completely empty. When Tommy and John found out about this, they were furious. They wanted recognition for their longtime friend. But Peter explained that he was happy with the design. By leaving his space open, it gave room for others to stand there in support, in solidarity. And this is what it means to not just be an ally, but to be an accomplice. To say, it's not about me, even as it is to recognize that another's struggle is bound together with my own. To be fully present for our siblings in struggle, and then to make room so that others might occupy our space. To know in our bones, in our blood, that right can never be wrong. To say, I'll stand by you, and mean it. For our eyes not to be full of fear, but love. Our closing hymn is number 348 in our hymnal, "Guide My Feet." Now, this is a hymn that we don't sing very often because the focus on running, when not all of us can run, can be problematic, especially if we don't take the time to explain the metaphor. But today, this song seems very appropriate. "Guide My Feet" is an African-American spiritual that is inspired by Psalm 119 in the Hebrew scriptures. The psalm is a cry to divine mystery from a people who are oppressed, but who are struggling not only to persist, but to live by their values. It's in honor of those who have taken the high road, who have risen to the challenge and met the demands of morality, even when to do so represented a true danger, even when it demanded of them the utmost courage, that we sing this hymn today.
Guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Oh, hold my hand. Hold my hand. While I run this race. Hold my hand. Hold my hand. While I run this race. Hold my hand. Hold my hand. While I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Stand by me. Stand by me. While I run this race. Stand by me. While I run this race. Stand by me. Stand by me. While I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. I'm your child. I'm your child. While I run this race. I'm your child. Your child. While I run this race. I'm your child. Your child. While I run this race. I don't want to run this race in vain. Guide my feet. Guide my feet. While I run this race. Guide my feet. Guide my feet. While I run this race. Guide my feet. Guide my feet. While I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of love and community, which burns in our hearts.
So go now in peace. Go now in compassion. And may the power of courageous love guide you and strengthen you always. Blessed be. Amen. Goodbye, everyone. Be well.